Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, 1969–74, who, faced with almost certain impeachment for his role in the Watergate scandal, became the first American president to resign from office. He was also Vice President, 1953–61, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States, 1969–1974, after previously serving as a U.S. Representative and a U.S. Senator from California. After successfully ending American fighting in Vietnam and improving international relations with the USSR and China, he became the only president to ever resign the office, as a result of the Watergate scandal. Reconciliation was the first goal set by President Richard M. Nixon. The nation was painfully divided, with turbulence in the cities and war overseas. During his presidency, Nixon succeeded in ending American fighting in Vietnam and improving relations with the USSR and China. But the Watergate scandal brought fresh divisions to the country and ultimately led to his resignation. His election in 1968 had climaxed a career unusual on two counts: his early success and his comeback after being defeated for president in 1960 and for governor of California in 1962. Born in California in 1913, Nixon had a brilliant record at Whittier College and Duke University Law School before beginning the practice of law. In 1940, he married Patricia Ryan. They had two daughters, Patricia, Tricia, and Julie. During World War II, Nixon served as a Navy lieutenant commander in the Pacific. On leaving the service, he was elected to Congress from his California district. In 1950, he won a Senate seat. 2 years later, General Eisenhower selected Nixon, age 39, to be his running mate. As vice president, Nixon took on major duties in the Eisenhower administration. Nominated for president by acclamation in 1960, he lost by a narrow margin to John F. Kennedy. In 1968, he again won his party's nomination, and went on to defeat Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey and third-party candidate George C. Wallace. His accomplishments while in office included revenue sharing, the end of the draft, new anti-crime laws, and a broad environmental program. As he had promised, he appointed justices of conservative philosophy to the Supreme Court. One of the most dramatic events of his first term occurred in 1969, when American astronauts made the first moon landing. Some of his most acclaimed achievements came in his quest for world stability. During visits in 1972 to Beijing and Moscow, he reduced tensions with China and the USSR. His summit meetings with Russian leader Leonid Brezhnev produced a treaty to limit strategic nuclear weapons. In January 1973, he announced an accord with North Vietnam to end American involvement in Indochina. In 1974, his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, negotiated disengagement agreements between Israel and its opponents, Egypt and Syria. In his 1972 bid for office, Nixon defeated Democratic candidate George McGovern by one of the widest margins on record. Within a few months, his administration was embattled over the so-called Watergate scandal, stemming from a break-in at the offices of the Democratic National Committee during the 1972 campaign. The break-in was traced to officials of the committee to re-elect the president. A number of administration officials resigned. Some were later convicted of offenses connected with efforts to cover up the affair. Nixon denied any personal involvement, but the courts forced him to yield tape recordings which indicated that he had, in fact, tried to divert the investigation. As a result of unrelated scandals in Maryland, Vice President Spiro T. Agnew resigned in 1973. Nixon nominated, and Congress approved, House Minority Leader Gerald R. Ford as vice president. Faced with what seemed almost certain impeachment, Nixon announced on August 8, 1974, that he would resign the next day to begin that process of healing which is so desperately needed in America. In his last years, Nixon gained praise as an elder statesman. By the time of his death on April 22, 1994, he had written numerous books on his experiences in public life and on foreign policy. Richard Nixon's 6 years in the White House remain widely viewed as pivotal in American military, diplomatic, and political history. In the 2 decades before Nixon took office, a liberal Democratic coalition dominated presidential politics, and American foreign policy was marked by large-scale military interventions. In the 2 decades after, a conservative Republican coalition dominated presidential politics, and direct military intervention was by and large replaced with aid, sometimes covered, sometimes not, to Allied forces. Nixon intended his presidency to be epical and, despite being cut short by Watergate, it was. Nixon and his presidency are often termed complex, sometimes contradictory. Scholars who classify him as liberal, moderate, or conservative find ample evidence for each label and conclusive evidence for none of them. This should be expected of a transitional political figure. In foreign and domestic policy, Nixon's inclinations were conservative, but he assumed the presidency at the end of the 1960s, liberalism's post-war peak. He could not achieve his overarching goal of creating a governing coalition of the right without first dismantling Franklin Roosevelt's coalition of the left. As president, Nixon was only as conservative as he could be and only as liberal as he had to be. He took credit for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency while privately noting that if he had not taken this liberal step, the Democratic Congress would have forced more liberal environmental legislation on him. This was a president who could philosophically oppose wage and price controls and privately express the conviction that they would not work, while still implementing them for election year effect. Still, his tactical flexibility should not obscure his steadiness of political purpose. He meant to move the country to the right, and he did. Nixon's most celebrated achievements as president, nuclear arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and the diplomatic opening to China, set the stage for the arms reduction pacts and careful diplomacy that brought about the end of the Cold War. Likewise, the Nixon doctrine of furnishing aid to allies while expecting them to provide the soldiers to fight in their own defense paved the way for the Reagan doctrine of supporting proxy armies and the Weinberger doctrine of sending U.S. armed forces into combat only as a last resort when vital national interests are at stake and objectives clearly defined. But even these groundbreaking achievements must be considered within the context of Nixon's political goals. He privately viewed the strategic arms limitation talks and the China Initiative as ways to blunt criticism from the political left. And while his slow withdrawal from Vietnam appeared to be a practical application of the Nixon doctrine, his secretly recorded White House tapes reveal that he expected South Vietnam to collapse after he brought American troops home and prolonged the war to postpone that collapse until after his re-election in 1972. Ultimately, the White House tapes must shape any assessment of Nixon's impact and legacy. They ended his presidency by furnishing proof of his involvement in the Watergate cover-up, fueled a generation's skepticism about political leaders, and today provide ample evidence of the political calculation behind the most important decisions of his presidency. They make his presidency an object lesson in the difference between image and reality, a lesson that each generation must learn anew. Historian and political scientist James McGregor Burns asked of Nixon, "How can one evaluate such an idiosyncratic president, so brilliant and so morally lacking?" Evaluations of his presidency have proven complex, contrasting his presidency's domestic and foreign policy successes with the acrimonious circumstances of his departure. According to Ambrose, Nixon wanted to be judged by what he accomplished. What he will be remembered for is the nightmare he put the country through in his second term and for his resignation. Erwin Gelman, who chronicled Nixon's congressional career, suggests, he was remarkable among his congressional peers, a success story in a troubled era, one who steered a sensible anti-communist course against the excess of McCarthy. Aitken feels that Nixon, both as a man and as a statesman, has been excessively maligned for his faults and inadequately recognized for his virtues. Yet even in a spirit of historical revisionism, no simple verdict is possible. Nixon saw his policies on Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union as central to his place in history. Nixon's one-time opponent George McGovern commented in 1983, President Nixon probably had a more practical approach to the two superpowers, China and the Soviet Union, than any other president since World War II. With the exception of his inexcusable continuation of the war in Vietnam, Nixon really will get high marks in history. Political scientist Jussi Hanhimäki disagrees, saying that Nixon's diplomacy was merely a continuation of the Cold War policy of containment by diplomatic, rather than military, means. Historian Christopher Andrew concludes that Nixon was a great statesman on the world stage as well as a shabby practitioner of electoral politics in the domestic arena. While the criminal farce of Watergate was in the making, Nixon's inspirational statesmanship was establishing new working relationships both with Communist China and with the Soviet Union. Nixon's stance on domestic affairs has been credited with the passage and enforcement of environmental and regulatory legislation. In a 2011 paper on Nixon and the environment, historian Paul Charles Milazzo points to Nixon's creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and to his enforcement of legislation such as the 1973 Endangered Species Act, stating that though unsought and unacknowledged, Richard Nixon's environmental legacy is secure. Nixon himself did not consider the environmental advances he made in office an important part of his legacy. Some historians contend that his choices were driven more by political expediency than any strong environmentalism. Some historians say Nixon's Southern strategy turned the southern United States into a Republican stronghold, while others deem economic factors more important in the change. Throughout his career, Nixon moved his party away from the control of isolationists, and as a congressman he was a persuasive advocate of containing Soviet communism. Historian Keith W. Olson has written that Nixon left a legacy of fundamental mistrust of government, rooted in Vietnam and Watergate. During the impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, both sides tried to use Nixon and Watergate to their advantage. Republicans suggested that Clinton's misconduct was comparable to Nixon's, while Democrats contended that Nixon's actions had been far more serious than Clinton's. For a time, there was a decrease in the power of the presidency as Congress passed restrictive legislation in the wake of Watergate. Olson suggests that legislation in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks restored the president's power. According to his biographer Herbert Parmet, Nixon's role was to steer the Republican Party along a middle course, somewhere between the competitive impulses of the Rockefellers, the Goldwaters, and the Reagans. Thank you for watching this video. Nixon's career was frequently dogged by his persona and the public's perception of it. Editorial cartoonists and comedians often exaggerated his appearance and mannerisms, to the point where the line between the human and the caricature became increasingly blurred. He was often portrayed with unshaven jowls, slumped shoulders, and a furrowed, sweaty brow. Nixon had a complex personality, both very secretive and awkward, yet strikingly reflective about himself. He was inclined to distance himself from people and was formal in all aspects, wearing a coat and tie even when home alone. Nixon biographer Conrad Black described him as being driven though also uneasy with himself in some ways. According to Black, Nixon thought that he was doomed to be traduced, double-crossed, unjustly harassed, misunderstood, underappreciated, and subjected to the trials of job, but that by the application of his mighty will, tenacity, and diligence, he would ultimately prevail. Nixon sometimes drank alcohol to excess, especially during 1970. He also was prescribed sleeping pills. According to Ray Price, Nixon sometimes took them in together. Nixon also took Dilantin, recommended by Jack Dreyfus. That medicine is usually prescribed to treat and prevent seizures, but in Nixon's case it was for depression. His periodic overindulgences, especially during stressful times such as during Apollo 13, concerned Price and others, including then-advisor Ehrlichman and longtime valet Manolo Sanchez. Author and former British politician David Owen deemed Nixon an alcoholic. Biographer Elizabeth Drew summarized Nixon as a smart, talented man, but most peculiar and haunted of presidents. In his account of the Nixon presidency, author Richard Reeves described Nixon as a strange man of uncomfortable shyness, who functioned best alone with his thoughts. Nixon's presidency was doomed by his personality, Reeves argues. He assumed the worst in people and he brought out the worst in them. He clung to the idea of being tough. He thought that was what had brought him to the edge of greatness. But that was what betrayed him. He could not open himself to other men and he could not open himself to greatness. In October 1999, a volume of 1971 White House audio tapes was released which contained multiple statements by Nixon deemed derogatory toward Jews. In one conversation with H.R. Haldeman, Nixon said that Washington was full of Jews and that most Jews are disloyal, making exceptions for some of his top aides. He then added, "But, Bob, generally speaking, you can't trust the bastards. They turn on you." Am I wrong or right? Elsewhere on the 1971 recordings, Nixon denies being anti-Semitic, saying, "If anybody who's been in this chair ever had reason to be anti-Semitic, I did. And I'm not, you know what I mean." Nixon believed that putting distance between himself and other people was necessary for him as he advanced in his political career and became president. Even Bibi Rebozo, by some accounts his closest friend, did not call him by his first name. Nixon said of this, "Even with close friends, I don't believe in letting your hair down, confiding this and that and the other thing saying, gee, I couldn't sleep. I believe you should keep your troubles to yourself. That's just the way I am. Some people are different. Some people think it's good therapy to sit with a close friend and, you know, just spill your guts, and reveal their inner psyche whether they were breastfed or bottle-fed. Not me. No way." When Nixon was told that most Americans felt they did not know him even at the end of his career, he replied, "Yeah, it's true. And it's not necessary for them to know."